So, okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit and have Bill tell us about something that he's been working on. So go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Hi, my name is Bill Brewster. I'm a senior engineering geologist with the Department of Water Resources North Central Region Office in West Sacramento. And as Lisa mentioned, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. This presentation covers the estimation of the change in groundwater and storage using groundwater level data as it was done for the California Water Plan Update 2013. I'll also be going over the methods and use of the Groundwater GIS Tool, which I'll describe in a little bit. And I also want to point out that much of this information is covered in more detail in the California Water Plan Update 2013 Change in Groundwater in Storage Appendix E document. So here's an overview, an outline of the presentation. I'll be discussing the background and goals of this project, going over what changing groundwater and storage means for this project, and also discussing various types of data. And then later on I'll be talking about the methodology and the use of the Groundwater GIS tool, and then follow up with some conclusions. After the publication of the California Water Plan 2009, it became clear that the department needed to provide a better way of estimating the change in groundwater in storage. So that came from feedback from the public and from some internal review. So the department thought about that and determined that it was really important to develop a transparent and repeatable and reliable process that used groundwater level data to estimate changes in groundwater in storage, and also a process to create some standardized reports, something that we can apply statewide. So those were the goals and objectives. So what does DWR mean by change in groundwater and storage? Well, this is a written description and a little formula, which basically states that we look at the groundwater elevations from two different time periods, and we determine the change in those elevations, and then multiply that by an overlying area, such as a groundwater basin, and then calculate the amount of change in groundwater in storage by applying a specific yield value. So this is a way to diagram that process. If you could imagine a cross-section of a groundwater aquifer, it has a number of wells installed in it. And then here's the groundwater level for period 1. These red triangles indicate where a groundwater level measurement was collected in that well. So then we move on to a later time, period 2, where we can collect additional groundwater level measurements. And then when we look at the difference in groundwater levels between those two periods, we get this region between these two groundwater levels in period 1 and period 2, and I've represented that as a volume kind of shown in this block down here. So from there, we can apply a specific yield value, and a specific yield converts the amount of a total volume of aquifer, saturated aquifer, and it allows you to calculate the amount of groundwater within that aquifer. So that's the basics on how we estimate change in groundwater and storage. So what kind of data do we need to do this? Well, there's three main types. There's well data, groundwater level data, and hydrogeologic data. Well data is essentially information about the well that we're collecting the data from. Most of this information is derived from well completion reports submitted by drillers when the well is drilled. The well completion report contains information about the well location, about the well construction, and in some cases about the materials that were encountered during the drilling of the well. Because these are submitted by individual well drillers, the quality is really variable. So you can see here's here's a comparison of two different well completion reports. Here you first of all, you can see that the forms are different. They've changed throughout the years. And then the amount of information related to where the well is located and its construction is highly variable. So groundwater level data is important to this process. Groundwater level data is the groundwater level measurements that are collected from wells by going out and visiting the well itself and measuring the depth of water. A groundwater level measurement records the location of the well and the depth of the water at that location. So that's kind of an XYZ point. And it also is collected at a specific time. So groundwater level measurement is a point in space and time. And then in some cases, information about the measurement is collected during the field visit. And this might include something like there was a nearby well pumping, or the well was experiencing conditions of artesian flows, or there's oil in the well. So these types of additional comments are metadata about the measurements. So what does groundwater level data look like? Here's one example of a number of groundwater level measurements collected at or around the same time for a particular region. You can see the location that the data was collected, and then also the symbology indicates the time at which the measurement was collected. So for example, if we pick a specific target date and we want to know if that measurement was collected near that target date, we could just look at this map here and see that the green measurements were collected near in time to the target date, whereas the red ones may have been several days or even weeks away from the target date. So we use this kind of symbology to get an idea of our monitoring, or water level monitoring collection. Another way to look at groundwater level measurements is to plot a chart called a hydrograph, where your groundwater level elevation is shown on this left column and time is shown on the bottom. So this hydrograph shows groundwater level measurements over time for a period of about 6 years. And you can see how groundwater levels rise and fall. And the main point of this slide is just to show that groundwater levels do vary over time. So the time at which you collect that measurement is really important.
You have to mention who was in the picture.
Yeah, so that's me many years ago when I didn't do webinars. So here's another slide to show that not only groundwater, or the location of the well, but the well construction is really important to the groundwater level data. So here on the left is a picture of a wellhead where what we call a multi-completion or nested monitoring well, where there are 4 wells each at a different depth, constructed at the same site. The hydrographs on the right show the water level measurements over time for each of those 4 wells. So for example, the red line shows the hydrograph for the deep well, the 331-foot well, and then the light blue line shows the hydrograph for the 98-foot well. So you can see that even though the well is at the same, or even though all these wells are at the same location, the water level response varies based on the well construction. So, what is our groundwater level data availability? We have a lot of groundwater level measurement records in our DWR water data library. In fact, there's 1.4 million or more records in that database, and it's growing every day. Unfortunately, groundwater level measurements are often unavailable when we take a look at applying the location, depth, and time constraints in some of the queries that we run. And I'll talk in more detail about that later. So hydrogeologic data is another important type of data, and that's information related to the actual aquifer where the groundwater is. estimating changes in groundwater and storage, the most important thing to consider is a storage coefficient, which in unconfined aquifer systems is called the specific yield value. And that's that little block I showed in the previous slide, where we use the specific yield value to convert a total volume of saturated aquifer to the available amount of groundwater in that aquifer. Hydrogeologic data is available for many, maybe even most, groundwater aquifers within within the groundwater basins in California, but it's not available in a consistent format. There's no one spreadsheet or model that can provide that information to us. So it's difficult to apply a consistent format to our change in storage tool. Because of that, we use a minimum specific yield value of 0.07 and a maximum specific yield value of 0.17 when we provide our estimates of change in groundwater and storage. So just to summarize the data types and availability, there's a lot of groundwater data. It's widely available, but it varies in location, time, and quality. So in some areas, groundwater data is not available to estimate the change in groundwater and storage using groundwater level data. This is something that we recognize fairly early on. So for the California Water Plant Update 2013, we did change in groundwater and storage estimates for the Central Valley, because that was where we could get the most consistent information over a large portion of California. So this is a good time for any questions, Lisa, unless you want to just keep moving on.
Go back to the assumption that you made about the figure 7 and the 1.7.
Yes.
Talk about that just a little bit more.
Okay, so one of the most important things about estimating change in storage is we determine a total volume of change between those two time periods, and then we convert that change or that amount of change to the amount of change in groundwater and storage. We looked at a number of studies that were available and found that there weren't really any that were usable throughout the entire state of California. We couldn't find a consistent way to look at that. So going back to some previous reports and then comparing that to some recent models such as the department's C2V SIM and USGS's CVHM, we came upon a minimum and maximum value that captured what we thought would be a realistic amount of change in groundwater and storage for the unconfined aquifer.
Great. Yeah, because that number obviously is appearing, and that's an important number. So how valid that number is pretty critical.
Yeah, and then if we have time at the end, I can elaborate a little bit on how we've moved on from just using those min and max values for in ways that we've improved the tool.
Perfect.
So, okay, shall we continue?
Please. Although I do feel like we should, if you end this session, you should get a I Heart Math bumper sticker.
Excellent. Maybe I already have one.
Maybe you have one.
Okay. So now I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about the methodology of how we estimate change in groundwater and storage, specifically for the California Water Plan. I'll start off by discussing the importance of data management and using GIS, and then also some assumptions and key concepts that were developed for this project, and then walk you through the Groundwater GIS tool and the steps that we apply using it. So first of all, it's important to note that this process or project of estimating changes in groundwater and storage requires a lot of data. It requires a lot of complicated queries of that data. For example, we look at water level measurements at a single well, or changes in measurements at a single well, groundwater elevation measurements for a region at a specific time period, or changes in groundwater level measurements over that region for a specific time period. So this requires some fairly sophisticated queries and analysis. So the way we manage those queries and data analysis is we use a workflow. So I'd like to just briefly go over what a workflow is in this case. We use a workflow. Workflow is a series of steps chained together in a logical order to create sort of a larger process. In this project, the first set of steps is collecting the data, storing it, and managing the data. So for estimating the changes in groundwater and storage for the water plan, those steps are actually already taken care of by other DWR programs. CASGIM is one of them that is currently done, and then other cooperating agreements that we've had with agencies, and then the use of our department water data library database is all sort of managed outside of the water plan. For this project, and for the calculations that we did for the water plan, we developed a workflow that queried the data, that did specific data analysis, and then prepared some specific reports. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about in the next series of slides. But first, I just kind of wanted to show you and illustrate why we use GIS for this. So here's a screenshot of the GIS platform, and you can see here it allows you to view the information in a map form, geospatially. And that's really important when we're reviewing the data. Issues and problems with the data stand out when you can actually see it in this type of form. Another thing that GIS allows is to simultaneously view the data in a tabular form. So these are all the attribute data or attribute information related to the groundwater wells and measurements collected in those wells. So by flipping back and forth between the attribute information and the geospatial information, it's a powerful tool, and it's a flexible tool of looking at and doing QA/QC on the data. So that's why we use a GIS format for this. So in order to really apply GIS to our workflows and do it in a logical and consistent and repeatable way, we needed to develop a number of assumptions and key concepts for this project. So we ended up with 8 assumptions, which were really used to simplify the complex systems such as groundwater aquifers or our water level measurement data set. And we use key concepts that apply specific rules to our geoprocessing workflows. So there's 8 assumptions and 7 key concepts. And I won't be going over every one of these, but I will touch on the ones that were most important. I also want to point out again that these are all discussed in more detail in the California Water Plan 2013 update, change in groundwater and storage Appendix E document. So just for convenience, I've listed all the 8 assumptions on a single slide. I won't read these, but if you print out the presentation, you'll have them handy. And then I've also listed the 7 key concepts. So let's take a look at some of these. One important assumption is that we're not pre-selecting our well data. So, we've got almost 40,000, I think at this point more than 40,000 wells in the database with over more than 1.4 million records. Why don't we just go ahead and find all of the best wells with the best information and the most comprehensive data, and then just pre-select those and not worry about the other ones? Well, we started to do that at first, and I'm just going to step you through an example. Let's say we're interested in the best wells in Central Valley for spring 2005, and then more specifically spring 2010 data. So we start off with almost 40,000 wells, and then we want to just look at wells that have depth and screen information in the database and well completion reports connected to those wells. So immediately we've pared down to much fewer wells. And then we want to make sure that the measurements are taken during the correct time period. So if we look at measurements between 2005 and 2010, and then only those that are in spring of 2010, we see that we even have fewer points to rely on. So now we're interested just in those in the Central Valley and an unconfined aquifer and are just dedicated observation wells. So clearly we can't just pre-select our wells that are what we would consider the best available wells. So instead, by implementing our workflows and rules and assumptions, we can go through and use all of the available well data and then filter it out using a QA/QC process rather than just pre-select the wells. So another important concept is that we're only comparing spring to spring groundwater level measurements. So one of the things about springtime measurements is we're calling it spring, but really it's a little bit more than just spring. The point is that we're collecting data from water levels prior to the first irrigation season of the year. And that typically is in springtime. During these times, the groundwater levels are at their yearly highs, and they're most consistent. So what does that mean? What really is spring? So springtime, after we started to look and analyze the data statewide, we found that spring really, or pre-irrigation, is really January to May. So in southern parts of the state, such as the southern San Joaquin Valley and in south of there, spring down there is really kind of January and February. And then up in the Sacramento Valley, it's we're able to, irrigation begins a little bit later. So spring is more like March and April. So that's why we had to use a broad range of dates to query our data. So just once again, to just kind of highlight that in a graphical form, this hydrograph shows the spring groundwater levels are highest in its seasonal rhythm of the groundwater elevations. The point at which the groundwater levels are highest changes, and the response of groundwater levels during this January to May time period varies, but in general we're collecting the highest groundwater levels each year and comparing that year to year. So, so moving on to another assumption is, in this slide I'll go through several different assumptions and key concepts. The first of which is that groundwater level change is calculated from 2 water level measurements in the same year. So let's illustrate this. So we have here our cross-section of our aquifer with our wells, and we have our groundwater table from period 1 showing. So let's go and collect our groundwater level measurements. And uh-oh, there's a mean dog, so we couldn't get a groundwater level measurement from that well during period 1. So now, now let's go and take a look at period 2. We're going to go, which is later than period 1, and we're going to go collect our groundwater level measurements from period 2. This time we can see that the groundwater levels have dropped below this well, so we were not able to get a measurement during period 2 at this well.
And I do want to mention, if you're online and you are watching your email instead of the screenshot, you missed the very frightening dog.
The mean dog. And that does happen. There's a well that I measured that has a mean dog, but he's behind a fence. So I can actually collect a measurement. Sometimes they get out.
It just popped our screenshots back up.
So, okay, so when we want to look at the change in the groundwater levels in these wells, we can really only use 4 out of the 6 wells here. And that's just an important point to show that you need water level measurement, more than 1 measurement in a well to get change in storage. So the next 2 assumptions or key concepts are related to boundaries and areas that are necessary to estimate the change in storage. So there's an assumption that states there is no groundwater level change at the edge of a groundwater basin. So for example, we see here the edge of our groundwater basin, And we're assuming that the groundwater levels do not change at this point. So we're calling this our zero boundary to indicate there's zero change at the edge of a basin. Another boundary that we need to consider is a boundary that divides the area of where we have water level data from where we do not have groundwater level data. So we're calling this the extent of data boundary, and it divides non-reporting areas from reporting areas. So when we provide a report of the change in groundwater and storage, it is just for the reporting area within the groundwater basin, and we acknowledge that some parts of that basin may not have available data.
So Bill, looking at your zero boundary, if it were a swimming pool, you would see the water level going down. So would that happen in this case with your zero boundary change?
If, well, and that's why this is an assumption, is that in that swimming pool, we couldn't really have a zero boundary. So we're assuming that at the edge of a groundwater basin, it's not like a swimming pool, in that we don't really know where the groundwater level might be right at the edge, but we're assuming that it doesn't change. And it's just an assumption that we do. It has to do with the geometry of how the tool runs its numbers and calculates its volumes. So this is a very necessary assumption to be able to estimate change in storage. It allows us to not have to know everything about the geometry of the actual groundwater basin. So it simplifies those complex systems.
Bill, shouldn't it also, theoretically at least, I just want to also, Bill, a clarifying question. This is Abdul. That theoretically, shouldn't it also in some way represent the groundwater ridge in the groundwater system, where there is an inversion from flow from one direction to another? The zero boundary?
No, we're not taking that into account for the zero boundary. We're not actually even accounting for subsurface groundwater flow. We are just looking at groundwater levels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
And I only cite it's counterintuitive, so
yeah,
there's a reason for it.
Yeah, it's a very important assumption, and it's discussed more in the Appendix E document, and I'm happy to talk more about it. It is a difficult concept. But it was very important to be able to move ahead with being able to estimate changes in groundwater and storage. Okay, moving on. This is what that slide looks like in map view. So I just want to point out that this is the edge, the outer edge of the groundwater basin. And for the water plan, we're calling this our zero boundary. We can actually define any boundary as a zero boundary, but for our water plan, we're calling the edge of the groundwater basin a zero boundary. Sub-basin boundaries or internal basin boundaries are not zero boundaries. This red line here is the extent of our data. So that means in this red hatched area, we do not have groundwater level data. It's very common for groundwater level data to not be available near the edge of a groundwater basin. Within the blue area, it's where it's an area within the groundwater basin where we do have data. And this area, this larger groundwater basin, has been subdivided into subbasins, which we're calling individual reporting areas. So now let's talk about the Groundwater GIS tool and how it functions. We'll go through the steps that the tool runs one by one. And this tool was developed specifically for the water plan to estimate changes in groundwater and storage. So as we run through the tool, the workflow, we query the data, and then from that data we create groundwater elevation surfaces from our monitoring period 1 and monitoring period 2. We estimate the total volume between these surfaces, kind of that blue hatched area I showed in the cross-section. We apply a storage coefficient to convert the volume to an estimated amount of groundwater in storage. And we also apply those boundaries, the zero boundary and extent of data boundary and subbasin boundaries. And then from there we can create our summary reports of the analysis for each reporting area. And then in between many of these steps, we have an opportunity to take a look at the well data using our GIS interface and query or QA/QC our well and water level data. So for those who like to work with GIS and Model Builder, this is what the GIS tool looks like if you peek behind the curtain. Each one of those little blobs is a different geoprocessing tool and a different step. So we're not going to talk about that today.
I do want to note
Thankfully.
that I'm sitting here next to Josh, our note taker, who is a GIS guy, and he's just smiling right now. He just looks really happy.
So yeah, so we could talk about that later if you want. So the first step is to query the data from the water data library using our GIS tool. And even though we don't pre-select all of our wells, we do need to enter several important parameters to get out enough information to create our first period 1 data set. So we look at the geographic region, which is a polygon feature. Then we use the date range parameters, so we enter an early date and a late date. So in this case, it's the January through May date range. Then we require a target date, which is March 15th for this project. If well data is available for wells in the database, we go ahead and filter the wells by depth. If that data are not available, then we go ahead and include the well, even though we may not know the well construction. There are a couple of questionable measurement codes. This is that metadata about the measurement. We do not use wells if they are pumping, and we do not use wells that if there is an indicated artesian flow. All the other questionable measurement codes are included, and we filter those out later as needed. Now, during our QA/QC checks, if we find a water level measurement that just doesn't seem appropriate when comparing it to the surrounding measurements, we flag that and we put it in what we call our excluded wells table. So this is a table that we use to document all of the wells that are not included in our change in storage analysis, and there's even coded values to indicate why that well was not used, and it's a well and or a measurement. So the excluded wells table is really important to allow for transparency and repeatability. We need to go back and rerun a query. So we use our parameters, we query our groundwater level data, and we do it twice, one for each period, period 1 and period 2, and we get a map view, something like this, where you can see the X's indicate groundwater level measurements for period 1, and the circles indicate groundwater level measurements for period 2. Also on the map is shown subbasin boundaries here, and then also the edge of the subbasin out here. For each period, we can make groundwater elevation surface. So this is what the groundwater elevation surface looks like for period 1. These are unsmoothed lines. They're tens, so they do look a little blocky, but it's a direct representation of point data. In this surface, you can see our groundwater subbasin here, and then you can see contours of equal groundwater elevation. And let's see if there's a little pin here. So from here, this is just showing us that the groundwater table elevation is kind of going downhill this way. So for period 2, this is what the groundwater levels look like. And one thing I want to point out is by putting these in surfaces, we can really take a closer look at the groundwater level data. Like, for example, where we have contours that are all bunched up, as in these two wells here, we might see that that this doesn't look natural. So we could go in using our GIS and open up the attribute information and really take a close look at these wells and make sure that these are appropriate measurements for this analysis. Also, we might see something over here kind of bunched up. So taking a visual look at this data really allows us to do a full QA/QC so that we're able to filter out water level measurements that may not be appropriate for estimating the change in storage. And that just reminded me to tell you that.
Yeah.
So now we have our monitoring period 1 and monitoring period 2, and we've QA/QC'd the point data. So we're going to take a look at the change information between those two periods. So this map here shows you all the points where we have groundwater level measurements from a well in both monitoring period 1 and monitoring period 2. And it also shows you wells that have measurements just in one of those two periods. So for example, this X here, the well has a water level measurement in period 1, but not in period 2, and vice versa for the circles. The colored dots indicate, or the symbology is used to indicate the amount of groundwater elevation change at each point. In this particular map, we see that darker reds indicate greater amounts of negative change, whereas greens indicate positive change. So where groundwater level measurements have increased between period 1 and period 2. So once again, this is another way that we can look at our data. For example, up here, we see that there's 2 points that look like they're on top of each other. The person doing this analysis could go in and take a look at these points and see if they're both appropriate or if there's any concerns about using both of these measurements at that point. So from more QA/QC. So now we have our change points. So we take our change points and then we apply our zero boundary to create a change surface. So you can think of a change surface as a thickness between period 1 and period 2. Over here is our zero boundary. So we apply a zero change here. And then here the thickness varies depending on the amount of change in our change wells. So for example, up in this area here, there's a greater amount of negative change than in these areas here. In some areas, there's a positive amount of change. So you can see just by visually looking at the data, you really get an idea of whether this looks reasonable or maybe there might be some water level measurements that don't quite look right. For example, I might want to take a look at these measurements here to see if this positive change is a real amount of change, considering it's surrounded by wells with a negative amount of change. So we're getting close to the home stretch here. We have our change surface. Now we need to apply our extent of data boundary to determine where the reporting and non-reporting zones are. And then after that, we'll apply our minimum and maximum specific yields to convert that total volumetric change to a change in groundwater and storage. So here, the red lines indicate the data extent. So that would mean we do not have any groundwater elevation data in this area or up in this area. So these areas are carved out and not part of the total change volume calculation. So here, for example, with this subbasin here, in this region here, we have a total change volume shown here. And this is the way the labels come up in the GIS platform. So it's kind of easy to do a quick check. You can see your area of your non-reporting area, acreage, your reporting area, acreage. And then in a separate table, we can take this change volume multiply it by our min and max storage coefficient to come up with this value here. So for this subbasin, in the reporting area in this subbasin, we have a minimum change volume of negative 112,000 acre-feet and negative 273,000 acre-feet.
Negative means it was a reduction of storage.
That means that the groundwater elevation declined, and it was a reduction in groundwater and storage. And that's why the map's red. It would be blue if there was an increase. And I just want to point out that these numbers were just used kind of for practice as we were developing the tool. These are not actual numbers. If you want the real numbers, you can go to the water plan for those.
So if you're in Woodland, you don't need to clutch your heart right now until you read the water plan.
Yeah, then read the water plan. Yeah. So let's just go through another example that mimics something more like what you would see in the water plan. So in this particular case, we're looking at the change from spring 2005 to 2010 in a portion of the Sacramento Valley. And so we've done our query here. You can see our points as the little dots there. And then you can see the, I'm sorry, let me get my arrow. And you can see our groundwater elevation shown here. So for example, this zero line is where the groundwater levels are at mean sea level, and these red lines are actually groundwater levels that are below sea level. So then we do it again for 2010, and we can see that there's really not a big difference. The trends are basically the same, and you can kind of flip back and forth, and you can see visually the change. But then we can actually run our tools to get our change surface. So in this particular area around, in this area here shown in the light bluish color, there's actually groundwater level increase or positive change in storage. And then in these darker red areas, you can see that's where the larger amounts of negative change in groundwater storage occurred. So that's just our change surface. Then we apply our boundaries. We can see our non-reporting areas in the red hatch. We can see our basin boundary out here. And then we can see our subbasins, which will be our reporting areas. And for the North American subbasin here, to use as an example, we have a total reporting area of a little over 300,000 acres. There was an average groundwater elevation change within that subbasin of a minus 0.3 feet. This is between 2005 and 2010. And that converts to a minimum amount of change in groundwater and storage of a minus 7,000 acre feet to a maximum change in groundwater and storage to a minus 18,000 acre feet. So we can put this on a chart. We've actually done this calculation for the water plan yearly from 2005 to 6 through 2009 to 2010. This chart shows you on the left the amount of change in storage, 1,000 acre feet. And on the bottom is the years. Down here is a little information about the water year type. So you can see between 2005 and 2010 was a fairly dry period. In the change in storage from 2005 to 2006 are using our minimum specific yield value. We had this amount of change, and I'm sorry I don't have that number in front of me, but I'll show you that in a second. And we have our maximum amount of change in storage shown here. Moving on, we see that there was a decrease in change in storage through the 3 dry, critical, and dry years, and then an increase again. These lines indicate the cumulative amount of change in groundwater in storage from 2005 to 2010. So we get here at the end of the chart and we see, using our minimum specific yield value, we have the minus 7,000 acre feet, and then the max would be the minus 18,000 acre feet shown here. So here's a chart showing that data using our 2 different storage coefficients and the yearly amount of change. We've also been able to just do a general average change in groundwater elevation. And then, do we have time for questions, or should we just go to the conclusions?
I think we're fine.
We're good?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's time we can go ahead and move on.
Okay. So now just to kind of wrap it up a little bit here. So in putting this tool together for this change in groundwater and storage project, well, actually, let me restate that. For the change in groundwater and storage project, we determined it was really necessary to build a custom tool and use GIS so that we could meet the goal of a repeatable, reliable, and transparent process. The GIS tool, it provides really effective queries of groundwater level data. It's very fast. Something that used to take 3 months takes 8 minutes, so I think that's a pretty big gain. It can provide very complex reports, not just the change in groundwater and storage, but other types of reports that involve groundwater level data. And it is very versatile. It's usable throughout the state. DWR staff can currently use it. It's not just one person. It's anybody who has a small amount of knowledge about GIS can apply the GIS tool. So some other things that came up, it's not a big surprise that data quality and availability is the most important aspect of estimating the change in groundwater and storage when you're using groundwater level data. The timing of the data collection by the different cooperating agencies and DWR is variable. When we wanted to look at springtime data measurements, often agencies will just go out and collect a single springtime measurement, and those were sometimes in January, sometimes in April, depending on where you were in the state and what your monitoring program consisted of. And that led to the fact that the quality and availability of the data is highly variable, not just water level measurements, but information about the wells and the hydrogeologic information. So currently DWR is refining the process of applying storage coefficients. So that gets back to that question about the min and max. Newer versions of this change in storage tool can actually apply storage coefficients that vary spatially. So we can take the CVHM model, which is broken down to 1 mile square grids for the Central Valley, and apply a different storage coefficient for each one of those 1 mile square grids, rather than just using a min and max value. So there have been some pretty significant refinements on the change in storage tool. And also I just want to point out that although the Water Plan Update 2013 was really the driver to really complete not only the analysis of changing groundwater and storage and the Groundwater GIS tool, but it's provided a lot of really great spin-off reports and analysis. So I just wanted to go over a few of these. So with this tool, we can look at the monitoring wells and sort of slice and dice our monitoring well information different ways, spatially or by type. Of course, we can create groundwater elevation contour maps. Another thing I didn't show you is that we can generate depth to groundwater contour maps, which is a very important way of looking at groundwater level data. We can create our change in groundwater level dot maps, as we like to call them. And in these maps, you just get a real coarse look at how groundwater levels have changed between 2 time periods. But you also get a kind of a mini statistical summary to see the magnitude of or the count of wells with either a positive or a negative change. So these types of maps have been well received because it conveys a lot of information very simply. And then of course there's the material that's provided in the water plan. So this is an example of the type of product that you might see in each of the hydrologic regions. And in the water plan, and then Appendix E actually has summary charts and tables for each subbasin within the Central Valley. And that's it. That's what I got. So I just thank everybody for tuning in.
Thank you so much. And if you're online, I know this was quite a bit of technical information. We've recorded this presentation, and the slides will be available at the Water Plan website. So you could go back and work through it again. But I just want to acknowledge that was a tough subject matter, and you really covered that in a really understandable way. So I think we should go a little bit.
On time.
Thank you. So just checking in then, if anybody is online, I am curious, you mentioned that you've had a very extensive stakeholder process. To what extent did the stakeholders inform the assumptions and key concepts that you developed? Were they involved at all in the preparation of the tool?
Yeah, so we had multiple check-ins with the Groundwater Caucus on this process. And in fact, when we got to some difficult, some of the real difficult problems were, how do we take this big batch of data and use it in a consistent way? So the caucus, they reviewed some of the processes that we used and gave us feedback on that. There's a fair amount of geometry that we need to use in here with regard to, what are we doing at the basin edge? What are we doing, at this data extent? How do we provide a consistent analysis if the data collection at the basin edge varies? So what we sort of cooked up in-house was provided to the caucus for review, and then they provided feedback to us. So that list that Mark had in his presentation of the number of stakeholders in the caucus, it was a very big group, and they provided a lot of really important feedback.
So really that vetting gives them more confidence to when you did make those assumptions. Those are things that people experience on the ground, and they know that pretty much plays out. So when you're looking at it, you can have some confidence in the numbers. So how about I've got a couple of folks here from local jurisdictions. They're wondering how they can get their hands on this tool.
Good question. Well, so the development of this tool was fairly complex. It took probably more time than real money to put together, but it was developed to be used internally for a variety of reasons. And right now we're thinking about how do we get this type of analytical tool out to the public. I think to do this type of really detailed change in storage analysis, it will take a while before we can a web-based application for this. Although some of the real important parts of this tool was the ability to query our water data library data by geographic region and date range and target date. So we're having internal discussions on how to make some of these types of queries available on our website. I don't think it's going to be available soon, but we're talking about it. It's doing this in a GIS platform such as ArcGIS is one thing, but to create those geoprocessing tools in a web-based environment, I don't think someone's going to want to click go and then wait 8 minutes while they're on a web page for something to happen. So that's really the big issue, is just making this something you can do in 3 seconds or less.
Well, if you started with AOL as your online provider, 8 minutes.
Right, yeah. I think that might have been when we started thinking about this. Yeah.
And so
yeah, the AOL version is almost done. Oh yeah, so one of the products that has come out of this is or one of the ways to view the groundwater level, depth to water, and groundwater elevation maps is through a Groundwater Information Center interactive map application. So I think Mark mentioned that earlier, and really it's not all of the water level data in the water data library. You get that through other avenues, but it does provide the user to view contour data, view depth to groundwater information, view change dot maps, and then press a download button and get that information themselves. So then they can consume that and use that in their own various map presentations. And because it's not automatically generated, what we're doing is in-house. We're creating these different layers for different years, and as we complete them, we post them. We're starting with current, 2015, 2014, and then working backwards. We haven't actually posted all of the water plan information on our interactive map application. Yeah, so that's one place to get it. And there's a place, there's a link to an email where you can provide feedback on your experience with the interactive map and if you're having any difficulties or suggestions.
Great. So if you were a county then and you had something specific you wanted to do, I mean, is that something where they could talk to DWR and look at something special, or is that realistic?
Yeah. So one thing that when this was first done was we would like to do as much ground truthing as possible. I think counties and other local agencies have done this type of analysis. This is the first time this has been done. This is just a particular way that DWR approached it. So if counties are interested in providing feedback or have any questions, they can contact me at the North Central Region office. Also, there's been some response from agencies outside of the Central Valley, especially in Southern California, where they appreciate the work that we've done. They do similar work, and we kind of want to do a comparison, a meeting of the minds to see how well the results from our process work with theirs. I mean, different processes use different data sets, different assumptions, different concepts. So you might end up getting different results. But the idea is if they're all within the ballpark, then they reinforce each other.
And following similar trends.
Yeah, so we have actually compared our change in storage results to other modeling results. We did a comparison with GRACE, for example, and have looked at C2V-SIM. And the tricky part of that is just getting our time frames down. Not all models compare spring to spring, so they don't always use the same reporting area. So you can't always do an apples-to-apples comparison.